Hi, I'm Cheryl and welcome to the Sewing Room channel. Have you ever wondered how they get all those little strips of fabric in between all the squares in a quilt? It's called sashing, and it's really quite easy, of course, once you know how. So in this tutorial, I'm going to show you a very basic beginner's type of sashing to put on a quilt. So let's take a closer look at a quilt. This is just a really small quilt that I've put together for this demonstration. Here are your quilt blocks. They could be just one piece of fabric, squares like this, or it can be multiple pieces of fabric. Here are the sashing strips I'm talking about. They can be really narrow. Right now I have just a very average width on mine, which is 2.5 inches, but I've seen them bigger than that. You also have sashing that's got real fancy squares here in between all the corners. But I'm just going to show you how to stitch the sashing pieces on between each square and then how to put a strip going between each row. So let's get started. I'm going to demonstrate how to put the sashing on 8.5 inch squares, and I'm only going to do 3 rows so that I can show you the entire process from start to finish. The length of your strips might be different than mine. If your blocks are bigger or smaller, then of course the length of your strips will be to whatever that size is. Right now for mine, I'm working with 8.5 inch square blocks, and my strips are 2.5 inches wide by 8.5 inches long. So for the quilt that I'm doing, is this little tiny quilt, I need 4 of these strips, these blue strips, for each row. So the first thing you want to do is bring them on top. So you're going to have on top here, one on each side, on opposite sides, and stitch 1/4 inch seam on each side. Then open this up and bring your next block on top, and then stitch a 1/4 inch seam. Then you would continue going across, stitching your pieces on, and then this one would go on to here, and then you would end with an 8.5 inch strip. So you have a piece of sashing at the beginning and end of each row and in between all of your blocks. Pressing your seams is very important when you're trying to put a quilt together. Your quilt will be a lot easier to put together, and it's just going to look so much nicer. So one of the things you want to do on this one when you're doing the sashing is you always want to press your seams towards the sashing. The first thing you want to do is press your seams on the back side. Then you're going to open it up and press on top. Remember, all seams are pressed towards the sashing strips. The next step is to put sashing on in between the rows. So you want to cut your sashing strips a little bit longer than what you need. It'll be trimmed off later, but it's going to be so much easier to get everything lined up if your sashing strips are too long. So I'm going to place this sashing strip on top here, and then I highly recommend that you pin your sashing on. So go all the way down to the end and pin. Then go ahead and stitch a 1/4 inch seam all along here. After you finish stitching, remember to press. As I said before, it's very important to press. So press on the back side first, then unfold and press on top. Then you would add it to the next row. So you would bring it front side down onto the next row and line it up. Now when you're lining it up, you can kind of feel where your other sashing strip is. So you want to make sure that you've got it lined up. Otherwise it's going to be all crooked. So that needs to be done. So you want to go to each spot and make sure it's good to go. Then go ahead and pin it and stitch up at the top, then press your seams on the back, unfold it, and then press on top. And you are pressing your seams towards the sashing strip. So I've got all the sashing strips on. Just make sure you start with a sashing strip, or excuse me, you have a strip at the top and the bottom as well as in between all your rows. Give it a good pressing. Make sure you have your seams pressed towards your sashing, and the very last step would be to trim your edges straight. So you need to trim these off, these little pieces of sashing that are sticking out. And what you want to do is place your ruler on the edge of your sashing here along there, not on this, because you're going to trim that off. And you're just going to go along and trim all of these off. And then you want to go to the other side and do the same thing. At this time, you could go ahead and finish your quilt off by layering your fabrics, the cotton batting, the fabric on the back, do your quilting stitches, and then put binding on the edges. Or if you wanted to make the quilt larger, you could add a decorative border around all four sides and then finish the quilt off. I hope you learned something new during this tutorial. Really try to do some sashing. Do it on a small quilt at first so that you don't get overwhelmed, and then you're going to find it's going to be a lot easier to move on to a larger quilt. Now make sure you follow me on Instagram and check out my Facebook page. One other thing I want to mention, if you want to get more into quilting and know about how to put borders on, check below the YouTube screen for video links to take you to other tutorials that I have. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time, and happy sewing! I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please click on the thumbs up button. Don't forget to click on share to share this video with your friends. If you haven't subscribed yet, click on that red subscribe button down there in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Don't forget to click on the bell. I'm Cheryl, and this is a lot of mayonnaise. See you next time, and happy sewing!